What's up? I am David Long. This video is part of the Non-Reductionist Fundamental series. This is part 1, Principles, and this is the deep dive. If you don't know what non-reductionism is yet, I recommend you pause this video and go watch the introductory video first. That'll give you the context that you need. What we're talking about in this video are the principles of non-reductionism. These are not preferences. These are not optional perspectives. These are foundational standards. These principles are the baseline conditions for being aligned with non-reductionism at all, which is why we're talking about them first before we get into the theory. If you're going to engage with non-reductionism, if you're going to represent it, if you're going to build with us, these are the principles you need to understand and adhere to. Without them, our project loses all of its integrity. No other meta-theory communities have explicit principles like this, and it becomes a major problem for the integrity and ethics of the community, their work, and their reputation. That's why non-reductionism makes these principles explicit and enforces them as non-negotiable fundamental standards. If these principles are violated or there's a lack of alignment, that's not just an arbitrary difference in style, opinion, or interpretation. That's a structural misalignment with non-reductionism. These principles represent the first level of alignment with our project. If you can get on board with these, you'll love what we're building together. If you can't, then non-reductionism is not a good fit for you at this time. And with that in mind, we're going to go through each of the principles one by one. The first principle is semantic compatibilism. Semantic compatibilism is the principle that different forms of language, like rational and poetic, and different kinds of symbol sets and language games each reveal different kinds of truth, allowing translation across disciplines without reducing one mode of knowing into another. In non-reductionist philosophy, semantic compatibilism is the cornerstone because it sets the stage for all the other principles. Universal ideas can wear different cultural costumes. Different worldviews might have different ways of saying the same thing and bring online important values and ideas that can be integrated into a holistic perspective while also understanding the differences and the pros and cons. Each form of expression is like a different lens that highlights certain aspects of reality while leaving others in the background. Each way of talking about things can hide and reveal aspects of the truth. By starting here, we establish that non-reductionism is fundamentally about integration. We hold these different language games together without collapsing them. This principle is the foundation that allows us to reconstruct a worldview where multiple ways of talking about things are honored and integrated. As an example, imagine you're explaining love. A scientist might describe the neurochemistry of oxytocin and dopamine. A poet might capture it in a metaphor about two souls dancing. A philosopher might explore the concept of love as a fundamental human value. Semantic compatibilism means we recognize each as a valid lens, each adding its own truth to the picture of what love is. Think of it like a tapestry. A single tapestry can be woven from different threads of different colors and textures. The scientific thread shows one pattern of truth, the poetic thread shows another, and the philosophical threads yet another. Semantic compatibilism is what lets you see the whole tapestry, appreciating how each thread contributes to the overall picture without forcing them all to be the same color or texture. That's the integrative vision that makes all the other principles possible. So another way of talking about semantic compatibilism and even how the word semantic compatibilism comes about is in the context of the free will versus determinism argument. Compatibilism is a way of saying that free will and determinism can be compatible with each other. Semantic compatibilism, in this context, is a way of saying that both third-person and first-person ways of talking about our experience are both valid. Usually, determinism and science talks about things in third-person terms, like billiard balls. This caused this, caused this, caused this, caused this. And there's also our normal first and second-person ways of talking about our experience and our relationships with each other, like I want to go to the store, a first person way of talking about things. And so this kind of position would hold that while we don't have free will, we have heavily conditioned will. We do have will, and our first person descriptions of I want to go to the store are true in a way, as well as third person descriptions of why you might want to go to the store and what caused that. That's one example of being able to have a nuanced view and honor multiple different ways of talking about things without collapsing everything into one perspective. Another way I like to talk about it is the cup and the sword, understanding that there's rational ways of talking about things and poetic ways of talking talking about things. And so when we see different ideas and different worldviews and different language games, it's about understanding them contextually, seeing what might be true and good about them, and being able to take a more nuanced view for a more healthy form of integration. So this is where the whole project basically starts, with an integrative perspective, valuing all different types of language games. So the next principle is epistemic humility. Epistemic humility is the disciplined recognition that while truth matters, every map of reality is just a representation of that terrain. It's about avoiding overreach by grounding claims in method and context. In non-reductionism, epistemic humility is the practice of acknowledging the limits in any single perspective. This doesn't mean that we abandon the idea of truth or fall into relativism. Instead, we hold our knowledge with a sense of discipline. We understand that each method, whether scientific, philosophical, or experimental, offers a partial map. This principle is about staying honest about those limits, ensuring that we don't overextend our conclusions beyond what our methods can truly support. Consider a mountain climber who's mapping out a trail. Epistemic humility is like acknowledging that even the best map is just a representation of that terrain. It's useful and it can be accurate, but it's not the territory itself. The climber uses the map with confidence, but they remain aware that the landscape may have surprises. In the same way, we hold our philosophical and scientific maps firmly, but humbly, always ready to refine them. Humility keeps inquiry honest by preventing arrogance or premature certainty. We understand the strengths and limits of different approaches to knowledge, as well as how we exist at particular holonic scales. And we understand the problems with talking about things at the micro and macro levels, which means our understanding is limited within a context. We have limited tools in terms of our capabilities to be able to perceive reality and limited ranges of possible experience. We've been able to extend that with microscopes and telescopes and things like that, but we're still just humans on Earth, and we can only exist within certain temperature ranges. We only see into certain spectrums and things like that. So there's limits of our knowledge in terms of actual accessibility and holonic scale. We're also in the middle of this scale of reality where we can't get outside of reality. At the most big picture scale, we don't know what our universe is from the outside. And at the most tiny scale, we have good measurements of what's happening with quantum physics and things like that, but we have massive problems with our ability to be able to interpret that data because we always talk about what's happening down there through the lens of what we understand on our level. And we only have relative language games to be able to talk about anything. So we have major subjective and relative limitations on our experience. But I'm also tempted to talk about it as epistemic contextualism, the principle of situatedness, the theoretical recognition that all knowledge claims are bound to their proper context, quadrant, methodology, and scale. A claim can be valid within its scope while invalid outside of it. Contextualism prevents category errors and reductionisms. And this is where 4P4Z, our epistemology and rigorous methodology, comes in. So our epistemic humility isn't just about knowing the limits of our knowledge, but also understanding how to contextualize that knowledge and apply the right methodologies in the proper context at the proper scale to be able to figure out how to know things. And epistemic integrity, the discipline of application, the rigorous practice of respecting the limits and responsibilities of each epistemic method. Integrity means applying methods where they belong, not overstretching their certainty and cross-checking claims through appropriate validation, like tetravalidation. This is about further not overstepping our ability to know. This is what allows us to really be trustworthy when we speak. People will know that we're operating with integrity within the context of what we actually can know and understanding how we can know it, and that we can back up our claims in a grounded way. So the next principle is discriminating wisdom. Discriminating wisdom is the ability to make grounded distinctions without collapsing into confusion or false equivalence. It means recognizing when an idea is coherent, useful, or developmentally valid, and when it's not. Further, it recognizes when we have enough clarity to know something is true or false and reject particular ideas. In non-reductionism, discriminating wisdom is about discernment, the capacity to say, this idea is beautiful but not empirically provable, or this concept works at a certain developmental stage but not another. Discriminating wisdom prevents us from treating all claims as equal or from dismissing certain perspectives without careful examination. It's a form of intellectual care and rigor. We learn to differentiate between between what can be tested, what can be symbolically meaningful, and what holds up under scrutiny, and further, what should be rejected. Discriminating wisdom allows you to appreciate symbolic beauty without mistaking it for a scientific claim. You might say, this idea as a poetic truth could be a valid way of talking about an aspect of human experience, but when interpreted as a specific literal fact, there are reasons to reject it. For example, idealism and racism. We reject those things. We know that racism and sexism and things like that are unhealthy, and we know that idealism as a worldview isn't literally true. Now, there might be poetic values in some of the symbols in religion that we can figure out different ways of cashing out that symbolism in ways that actually works within a naturalistic framework. But in terms of the literal claims, we don't believe that stuff. Example could be reincarnation. We recognize that self is a concept and there's no essence or soul that transfers to other bodies through some supernatural ethereal realm. And we can even understand that ideas like karma and dharma and reincarnation have been used in the context of Hindu mythology to reinforce the caste system and build racism into the structure of society. Like, if you accept your caste now, then maybe if you're good and do what you're supposed to do in your next life, you'll be born good and white, and then you'll be allowed to have this other different role within society. It's a great way to maintain systematic oppression. A lot of people don't realize that because they might tend to think of other traditions as being beautiful because they don't have to live inside the consequences of those ideas in the way that people who live in those societies do, while often we're much more likely to realize the problematic nature of our local religious ideas and how those show up in messed up ways that actually hurt people. But that being said, even though we might reject the idea of reincarnation as a literal truth about literal souls, there's potentially a poetic way that it could be true in that each day we're born again and we're living inside the context of the karma of our past lives. Every 7 years or something like that, we have a whole new body. Our concepts of self change over time and we become different people. So there could be poetic ways that those ideas still resonate while also rejecting the literal claims. So discriminating wisdom. We can say what's healthy and what's unhealthy. We can say that we know certain things are true and false. Also on the topic of discriminating wisdom, Non-Reductionism has an exciting project coming out called Atlas, which is assessing theoretical legitimacy across scales, which is a bit to unpack here, but it's basically a way of talking about the status of different scientific theories or different worldviews, evidence that proves it, how much it engages with science, and how much it's integrated into scientific knowledge. This is an exciting project, even at first, because it can settle certain debates about what the status of particular ideas are. But further, it extends into issues of philosophy of science. And in that context, we're making claims about the status of knowledge in general. And since we're creating kind of a database of different theories and what their status is, we can actually map the status of knowledge across different domains at different ontological scales of reality. We'll have some videos about this later as it progresses, and there will be a book coming out about it. Keep your eye out for that. But in the meantime, as it relates to these past couple topics, I can tell you that non-reductionism is not fallibilist. We don't go with this idea that knowledge is infinitely provisional or that there could always be something more that we could learn that would change our views. There's such a thing as closure. There's phenomenon closure in that we know this phenomenon exists and is real. And there's such a thing as mechanistic closure, which is we know how this phenomenon works. And then on a larger scale, we could talk about the maturity of our knowledge in general and ideas about epistemic plateau at particular scales or as it relates to particular areas of research. So we're not talking about fallibilism. Non-reductionist position on knowledge is called representational realism, which is basically a way of saying that our representations or our maps are actually talking about something real, even if sometimes our representations are incomplete, and even if in some cases we end up changing our ideas based on more evidence. So a couple of useful analogies are, we already talked about the map and the territory. For a map to be a legitimate map, it has to actually align with the territory in real ways. That's what it means to have real knowledge. There are real representations of the territory, and in some places, those representations of the territory are one-to-one and complete. For example, H2O. Sure, we're using symbols like H2 and O, hydrogen, oxygen, but it accounts for the ontological reality of that thing, and it is complete, and nothing we will ever learn will ever change that fact. Another helpful metaphor is the idea of a puzzle. If you have a puzzle and it's a picture of a horse. Even if the puzzle is missing a piece, there's nothing that could happen on that piece that would change the fact that we know that this is a picture of a horse. So incomplete knowledge is not the same as not knowing. We don't need to know everything to know anything. So I would invite you to keep an eye out for Atlas, our videos that are coming out about that, the book that's coming out about that, link in the description. This brings us to our next principle, which is emergentism. And further, I would say that what we're talking about here is not just emergentism, but evolution and an understanding of naturalism as opposed to idealism, although we're not talking about a reductionist version of materialism that acts like the only things that exist are things that are tangible. But basically, the point here is that science gives us answers and we know what those are. In particular, I'm emphasizing emergentism as an answer to the common misconceptions about what consciousness is. Consciousness becomes this mushy term. Are we talking about sentience or sapience or metacognition? And we know tons of things about the emergence of consciousness at multiple layers. We know that consciousness is nested in reality. Reality isn't nested in consciousness. So we're getting the nesting correct here. We're getting the primacy correct. We know answers about primacy. Emergentism is the recognition that higher order realities like consciousness, value, or identity arise from simpler parts. While everything has a physical basis, certain qualities and meanings emerge at higher levels of complexity. For example, you won't find consciousness or moral values by examining individual atoms. These realities emerge when parts come together in complex systems. Emergentism helps us honor the layered nature of reality, seeing that each level, from physical to biological to cultural, has its own truths that can be explained in terms of how they arise, to the extent to which we know that, but the semantics about what's happening on those levels are not reducible to lower levels. Like, we don't talk about culture in terms of what's happening with atoms. So each level has its own new level of semantic value, which is why we've moved from chemistry to biology and culture, and each have their own different languages and ways of talking about things. Now, I probably should do a little bit of a qualifier here, because the kind of non-reductionism that we're talking about here is more of like a semantic non-reductionism. We're non-reductionists in that we honor multiple different ways of talking about things. So our form of non-reductionism here is a form of semantic non-reductionism, not in terms of the conversation about consciousness and emergentism. Just to be clear, if you listen to what I was saying in the very first point about semantic compatibilism, that is the semantic non-reductionism. We are reductionists in that reductionism, in the context of consciousness studies, is the idea that every new level of development can be explained by what's happening at the lower level of development. Nothing's popping into existence out of nowhere, which doesn't mean that the emerging distinctions are reducible to explanations at lower levels. A lot of times people talk about things like the hard problem of consciousness or weak versus strong emergence, and we reject those distinctions as straw men, in the same way that saying evolution and its cumulative selection is random chance. You would think intellectuals would be generally smart enough to reject these ideas in the same way that they generally reject them when it comes to evolution. But for some reason, people still take some of these ideas seriously. There is indeed a major lack of discriminating wisdom, even in intellectual and philosophical spaces. We're talking about rhetorical manipulation, straw man fallacies, false equivalency fallacies, God of the gaps, arguments from ignorance. Because idealists don't have any good reasons or evidence on their side, what they usually do is they try to start their argument by bringing down science. They start calling it religious names like a dogma or a doctrine to try to bring science down to their level. And then they try to act like it's ridiculous or that it doesn't make sense. They try to poke holes in it and then offer up their worldview as the alternative. This is how idealists and panpsychists argue for their view. They only make a negative case against emergentism and then offer their view up as the only reasonable alternative. Some people might be convinced that these are two opposite positions. So if it's not one, then it must be the other, but that's actually not true. There are several alternative views: idealism, panpsychism, dual aspect monism, solipsism, etc. So this strategy relies on a false dichotomy, in the same way that Christians might think if they can poke holes in science and say that God must have created it, that means their religion is true. But there's a lot of different religions and there's a lot of different concepts of who and what God is. So that also doesn't work for the same reason. They're postulating an extra substance, which violates parsimony. And it can't just be said that it's a different interpretation. There's no evidence for their view, and it's not falsifiable. So it's not scientific. It doesn't even rise to the level of a hypothesis because it can't be tested or proven wrong. Whereas emergentism could definitely be proven wrong. For example, if we could see anything anywhere that showed the functions of consciousness without the equipment that's supposed to be required for that type of function, it would be debunked. But we don't see that anywhere. Long story short, these alternative worldviews are debunked, and they're just religious storytelling dressed up as if they're rational when they're not. I wonder if science class was under attack from Buddhism in the same way that it has been under attack from Christianity if you wouldn't have scientists coming out and saying emergentism is a fact in the same way that they came out and said evolution was a fact. But the arguments put forward by idealists and panpsychists and dual aspect monists are really the intellectual equivalent of creationism. And we know that all the philosophers from philosophy history who advocated for these positions are in fact religious believers. So we should really be smart enough at this point to reject these ideas and go with what science has already shown us. The metaphor I sometimes use is imagine we have a whole puzzle already put together on the table, and we can see what the picture is. We know that emergentism is true. We know that evolution is true. And just because there's a couple missing puzzle pieces here and there doesn't mean that we don't know what the picture is. Yeah, there are still gaps in our knowledge about consciousness. Things like the coding problem. How does the brain translate what it sees? But we do have one-to-one correlations between equipment and functions, which is the best you can do. And we know tons of things about the emergence of consciousness at multiple layers. I know I'm pressing hard on us getting to accept things like evolution and emergentism here, but naturalism is the true and correct worldview. And for us to be able to really get to a mature perspective is to really just accept the science and what it shows us and to reject outdated literal creation myths. Humanity really needs to get to a point where it understands that all these old religious ideas are debunked and that all the interesting conversations are on the other side of accepting that fact. So this distinction is important, but I do think that there are going to be a lot of people who struggle with it. And while I think it's important to draw a firm boundary around this, I'm not just saying that it's true because I'm claiming it. It's not a preference or an opinion. It's just a fact. Some people might have a hard time accepting that it's a fact. A lot of people might make arguments that are not really good arguments for these kinds of things, like, oh, there's not consensus around these things, or it's still being debated. Well, that's true around creationism versus evolution too. It's true about global warming. It's true about a lot of things. It doesn't mean that we don't know the answer. So while I'm claiming that we do know the answer and that to align with truth and evidence and science and rationality, you have to be on one side of this argument, I don't think it's good to just claim that. So I started working on an article about it that brings up and deals with all the points, and it actually ballooned into a book. So very soon I'll have a book coming out called Emergent Naturalism, where I explain in detail and deal with all the points as it relates to these things. Check the description for a link to the book, and I think it's important to make these arguments accessible and clear. I'll also include things like some audio clips or some parts of the book that I think will help make this argument, but I also don't want to waste a bunch of time redebating this thing over and over again. I've debated it in the past. I made a sword in the stone challenge about it for idealists that they have never been able to rise to, and I'm feeling pretty much done with it. But I would still want to invite people to get the book. If you want to debate it, rise to the bare minimum challenge of proving that you have a ground up, positive, rational case for your view that the Sword in the Stone challenge asks you to rise to. I don't think all people who are sympathetic to idealism are religious thinkers. I think a lot of people just don't know what to think about these things yet. But as a person with good epistemology, good standards, who cares about rationality and science and evidence, I'm telling you, there is a case closed conclusion on this topic. And if you read the book and engage with the arguments, you'll see why I'm saying that. So definitely check out the book, check out the article, check out the link in description, and find out why. The next principle is sacred naturalism. Sacred naturalism is the conscious choice to approach life with reverence, rooted in the reality of lived experience, not supernatural beliefs. It means honoring the depth of subjective life and our interconnection with nature. Sacred naturalism bridges the gap between a sense of the sacred and a commitment to naturalism. We do not claim the universe is inherently meaningful in a supernatural sense. Instead, we choose to relate to life with reverence because of the richness of our actual lived experience, because we care about the feelings of conscious creatures who can have experiences. This principle means saying yes to life, even amidst complexity and suffering, finding a form of sacredness that doesn't require mystical or supernatural stories. It's about respecting the value and depth of the real world and experience within it. So in our last point, we were basically talking about the importance of honoring scientific understanding and how we arrive in a naturalistic worldview. In this point, we're talking about on the other side of existential deconstruction and the deconstruction of religious ideas with science, a healthy reconstruction that says yes to life and making meaning within it. So sacred naturalism is a way of reintegrating the value and the meaning and the purpose in a way that still aligns with what we understand about truth and the world that we live in. So this gives us the ability to have a type of healthy life practice, what some might call spiritual practice, and a healthy religion without superstition and divisiveness. So I could say a lot more about sacred naturalism, but I'll try and really be brief. If you think about sacred naturalism and what I originally said about semantic compatibilism, there's an understanding of the transrational. Transrationality is understanding the relative nature of language in general, and often specifically, it's used as a way to make a distinction between the metaphorical truth of something versus the literal truth of something. So a certain idea could be interpreted in a pre-rational, magical, and mythical way, in a literal, rational way as a truth claim, or in a metaphorical and symbolic way. And these metaphors and symbols transcend and include rationality. So they still have to cash out in a way that actually rings true. For example, if you think that the tortoise and the hare is about a literal tortoise and a hare, you've missed the point. It's actually about how we live, that slow and steady wins the race, that being patient and putting in the work pays off. In this case, we're talking about the integration of religious symbolism as cultural mythology, as metaphor and poetry that can potentially cash out in accord with reality. So basically, we're integrating in the best of what religions have to offer with fair overarching standards, not favoring any particular symbol set, with an understanding of the universals that appear across multiple traditions, as well as the ways that particular religions are almost like unique cultural experiments in extreme ideologies that render interesting results that we can learn from. The good thing about this approach to religion and spirituality is that it allows for variety with consistency, personal and cultural variations with overarching coherence. In other words, different individuals can have their own approaches to symbolism or to practice, and that's not necessarily a problem. They can still practice the same religion, even though they have their own different variants on it. And different cultures in different places could also have their own different emphasis in terms of ways that they like to make sure that the important bases are covered in their own kind of style. So in terms of a holistic approach, what matters is covering all the bases, not necessarily the method that you use to cover those bases. So as long as you're covering all the quadrants in your own personal life practice, like an upper left being focused mental practice, an upper right becoming focused self-mastery practice, a lower left practice of compassion, like giving back, a lower right structural coherence and application, some kind of a practical philosophy. That's a holistic and integrative approach. Of course, there's more to it, but we'll get into that further down the line. And in terms of religion itself, there are important functions that religion plays. Religio, or religion, means linking the individual back to the big picture or to the absolute. And religions, when they're working properly, serve four main functions, and they correlate pretty well to the quadrants. In the upper left, there's a mystical function, which is about opening up the individual to the mystery of reality, which is also their mystery. The key word here being mystery. In the upper right, there's the cosmological function, which is about aligning them with the knowledge and the situations of the day and the time in which we live in. So one of the reasons a lot of religions are unhealthy is because their ideas are outdated and have nothing to do with what we now know about reality or the kind of world that we live in today. There's also the social function in the lower left, which binds together cultures with roles and rules. The pedagogical function in the lower right, which is about rituals like weddings, births, deaths, funerals, things like that. So a healthy life practice and a healthy religious practice can definitely be had in a sacred naturalist perspective in a way that covers all of our bases, is really healthy for both the individual, their life, their meaning, their purpose, and it serves all life, all living beings, all cultures, the environment, and aligns us with reality in a healthy way. So of course, I have a lot more to say about this, and we'll get into it in future videos. And yeah, I got a book about sacred naturalism coming out as well. It's already in the works. I actually got a whole series of books planned. This one's not going to come out in 2026, but if you're watching this in 2027 or later, check the description. Maybe it's out. So we've now covered the first 5 principles. Before we move on, I want to zoom out for a second and clarify what those first 5 are actually doing as a whole. These first 5 principles are about ideas. They're about how we understand, interpret, and align with reality. Semantic compatibilism establishes the integrative framework. It allows us to include different language games and different lenses to access different kinds of truth without collapsing into reductionism, conflation, or relativism. Then you have epistemic humility and discriminating wisdom. Epistemic humility is about recognizing the limits of our understanding. It's about understanding that our maps are not the territory and being aware of the perspective we're operating from. Discriminating wisdom is the counterbalance. It's the ability to make real distinctions, to say what's true and false, what's good and harmful, healthy and unhealthy, based on appropriate methods and grounded reasoning. So we're not just being humble, we're also standing on business, standing up for what is known to be true, good, better, best, and being clear and having standards. Then you have emergentism and sacred naturalism. Emergentism grounds us in naturalism and a rational scientific alignment with what we know about reality, how higher order phenomena arise from underlying processes. Sacred naturalism brings meaning, value, and purpose online without appealing to anything supernatural. It's about reverence for life grounded in reality. So we can synthesize science and meaning, rationality and poetry without contradiction or confusion between them. What these first 5 principles are doing is synthesizing key tensions with grounded standards: humility and clarity, science and meaning. This is about holding complexity without collapsing into one reductionist extreme or the other. These first 5 principles are about how we think. The next 5 principles are about application, how we act, how we embody this philosophy, and how this way of understanding actually shows up in real behavior and real-world engagement. So now we're moving from understanding into action. Sorry to interrupt. Just one moment. I'd like to talk to you real quick about Patreon. So for a long time, what I used to do is I would just ask for your support on Patreon. I'd put your name at the end of the video, give you a big thank you, and call it good. But I've been putting more thought into how I can bring more value to my awesome Patreons who support this important project. For those of you who still want to do the basic amount of support, we have the supporter tier. You can give $5 or $10 and it'll be the same deal as before. I'll put your name at the end of the video, give you a big thank you and a shout out, and we'll call it good. But for those of you who are looking for more, who want to dig in deeper, we have the participant level Patreons. They'll get the same thing as before, but they'll also get to come to this live Q&A. And if you want to become a participant plus, you'll get to do all those things, come to the live Q&A, and come to a monthly private training. And for those of you who really want to dig in deep, join at the apprentice level. Get everything we've mentioned before, as well as an hour or 2 a month with me for private coaching or training or whatever you'd like. I know there's a lot of people on the internet right now who are asking you to become their Patreon, but remember, this is a small community, and so your support is much needed and much appreciated. Big thanks to all the people who support on Patreon. It really means a lot to me, and it's going to make a lot more possible going forward. Thanks so much for listening to me talk about Patreon. I'll let you get back to your video now. The next principle is symbolic responsibility. Symbolic responsibility is the principle that we must use metaphors, symbols, and stories consciously and appropriately, understanding that language shapes perception and perception shapes action. Symbolic responsibility is about being intentional with the stories we tell and the metaphors we use. We recognize that symbolic language is powerful. It can inspire, guide, and shape how people see the world, but it can also mislead if used carelessly. This principle calls us to consider our audience and context. We must ensure that a metaphor isn't taken as a scientific claim, or that a myth used for cultural meaning isn't mistaken for a literal fact. Symbolic responsibility means communicating with precision, intention, and so the meaning is clarified rather than distorted. Imagine you're telling a story to help someone understand a complex idea. For a child, you might want to use a simple metaphor like the environment is like a shared garden. For an adult, you might want to use a more nuanced symbolic analogy. Symbolic responsibility means you're always aware of how your audience might interpret these symbols. You choose your words so that way the message lands clearly and constructively without creating confusion or unintended literalism. This is also where the rules of transrational engagement come on. I'll run through them real quick. It's a stage-aware guide for ethical intentional and effective use of symbolism, metaphorical, and mythopoetic language in service of clarity and transformation. So rule number 1 is do not use transrational language with pre-rational interpreters. So avoid using mythopoetic, symbolic, or metaphorical religious language with people who do not yet have the capacity to interpret it as symbolic. They are likely to take it literally, which reinforces magical thinking and spiritual bypassing. And so we don't talk about divine embodiment or a universal soul or something like that with a mythic blue stage believer who interprets everything literally. Rule number 2 is symbolic translation is permissible for behavior alignment, not conceptual clarity. So you may use literal religious language to translate to motivate ethical or healthy behavior, but do not expect mutual understanding of the metaphor. The purpose here is that promotes positive behavioral change without disrupting worldview coherence. So saying something like, God wants us to be good stewards of the environment to someone at Blue, knowing that they take that literally, but you're using it strategically, not philosophically, to help them to be more healthy where they're at. In other words, we're not taking away their symbols. We're appealing to their symbols to help them to be more healthy where they're at. That's the translation strategy. Rule 3, prioritize rational clarity in blue to orange transformational work. When attempting to move someone from blue conventional to orange rational, avoid symbolic or poetic language. Use clear rational framing, empirical evidence, and logical distinctions. This supports the epistemic shift towards rational autonomy, critical thinking, and objective analysis. From green to yellow, introduce metaphor explicitly as metaphor. When working with postmodern green interpreters, begin introducing symbolic language with clear framing. This initiates transrational cognition by modeling conscious symbolic use. Rule number 5, use transrational language freely only in mutual transrational context. Only speak in an open mythopoetic or trans-symbolic language when mutual understanding is confirmed. All parties should have symbolic literacy and epistemic clarity. This ensures communication remains clear, resonant, and developmentally aligned. It avoids aesthetic confusion. When speaking with someone like yourself, it's appropriate to say something about Christ consciousness or Buddha nature, or what it means to be a bodhisattva. We could say that we align with some of these ideas with people who also understand that we're not literal practitioners of these traditions. Rule 6, even when used in transrational space, symbolic language must be tethered to real meaning across quadrants. Avoid free-floating poetry that bypasses critical engagement. This maintains epistemic hygiene and symbolic integrity. Principle 7, developmental responsibility. This is about translation. So developmental responsibility is the principle that personal and cultural growth follows recognizable patterns, and that we have an ethical responsibility to support and nurture that development in ourselves, in others, and in society. Developmental responsibility means recognizing that human growth isn't random. People and cultures evolve through consistent stages, and each stage has its own needs and challenges. This principle invites us to act with wisdom and compassion by understanding where individuals or groups are developmentally and meeting them there. It also means taking responsibility for our growth, continually refining our understanding, and helping create environments that support healthy development. Growth is not just a personal journey, but a collective responsibility. Think of a teacher who understands that a child's ability to grasp certain concepts depends on their developmental stage. The teacher doesn't force advanced ideas on a child who isn't ready. Instead, they guide the child step by step, nurturing their growth. In the same way, developmental responsibility means that as leaders, thinkers, and creators, we shape our actions and communications to support the developmental needs of those we're engaging with. It's about helping others grow without imposing or rushing the process. So this is about meeting people where they are and working with them in context. So we don't rush people up the spiral or pull people up to our stage. We meet them where they are, and we recognize that there are early, mid, and late versions of each stage, as well as different variations on each stage. And we want to figure out where a person is at, what their variation is, and how to work with them appropriately. If a person is new to a stage, they probably need to spend more time in that stage to really embody and learn its lessons. So if we meet a person who's still early in that stage, we want to help them to really understand what the important lessons and values of that stage are. If we meet a person who's been in that stage or is stagnant in that stage, we want to engage with them in the context of their ideas. If a person is late in that stage and some of their ideas are starting to break down and they're starting to also have ideas in the next stage and their old ideas aren't serving them anymore, then we can help them transition. But we do that by actually guiding them into the next stage, not by trying to then yank them up multiple stages. This is about our commitment to engage in the development of humans and cultures responsibly. The next principle is about contextual skillfulness, and this has to do with roles and appropriateness. Contextual skillfulness is the principle that ethical and effective action depends on understanding the context, including developmental stage, role, and systemic structures, and responding skillfully within that context. Contextual skillfulness is about the art of acting appropriately given the situation. It means that we don't apply a one-size-fits-all solution. Instead, we consider who we're interacting with, what the role we're playing is, and what the developmental and systemic context is. This principle emphasizes skillful means, the idea that the right action is not just about good intentions, but about choosing the right approach for the right context. It's about knowing when to speak, how to speak, and what kind of guidance or support is truly needed in a given situation. A lot of people emphasize things like authenticity as a value, and we're actually more interested in this idea of skillful means and appropriateness. So this doesn't negate authenticity, because we're different with different people in different contexts. As a teacher, I have certain responsibilities. As a partner, I have certain relationships and responsibilities. As a son or a brother, a sister, or a friend, each context requires a different type of engagement and expression from me. And I really want to think about what is the highest form from my perspective of each one of those roles. So when I decide to embody that role in alignment with my highest values, that's not inauthentic. That's actually potentially more authentic to what my real values are. A lot of times, what is passed off as being authentic is actually just impulsive. So what we're really talking about here is taking responsibility for the different types of roles that we play and playing them well. The next principle is about coherence as integrity. Coherence as integrity is the principle that choosing to live and act with clarity, alignment, and interactive coherence is a form of ethical responsibility. In a fragmented world, coherence is not a luxury, but a form of care. Coherence as integrity means that we strive to align our thinking, our methods, and actions so that they form a clear, integrative whole. The principle is about embodying wisdom in a way that is not fragmented or contradictory. When the whole world is full of confusion, mixed messages, and disjointed thinking, choosing coherence is a rational act of integrity. It's about ensuring that our philosophical principles, our communication, and our real-world practices all reflect a consistent and caring alignment. Coherence as integrity is you ensure that your principles, your way of speaking, and your actions are all aligned, creating a stable and trustworthy whole. In doing so, you offer clarity and care to those around you, demonstrating that coherence is indeed a form of integrity. A lot of these previous principles, symbolic responsibility, developmental responsibility, and contextual skillfulness all might seem like a type of being undercover or translating and working with people where they're at. And this principle of coherence as care, clarity as care, this is about how we act in the context of those different roles of meeting people in terms of their development, in terms of our role in context, in terms of our skillfulness and appropriateness. All of this is in service of clarity and coherence. So when we meet people developmentally, or when we meet people in the context of our role, or when we're acting appropriately, it's to make things more clear. It's to bring coherence. It's to bring clarity as a form of care. So all of these are different ingredients in how we engage with people. The last principle is generative responsibility. The idea of developmental responsibility was more about translation, but generative responsibility is more about transformation. Generative responsibility is the principle that once we understand and integrate knowledge, coherence, and developmental insight, we have a responsibility to actively create and build what is needed in the world. It's about moving from insight to action. Generative responsibility means that we're not just observers or commentators, we are builders and creators. Once we've developed a clear and coherent understanding of reality and we've recognized the developmental needs of individuals and cultures, we have an ethical duty to generate new systems, practices, and frameworks or art that reflects those insights. This is about moving beyond critique or theoretical understanding into tangible contribution. We take responsibility for bringing forth what is missing, whether that's new educational tools, innovative social systems, or creative work that embodies our values. Imagine a gardener who doesn't just study the soil and plants, but actually cultivates cultivates a thriving garden. Generative responsibility is about becoming that gardener in the realm of ideas and systems. You don't just understand what a healthy culture or practice looks like. You take responsibility for planting those seeds and nurturing them into reality. So let's bring all of this together. The first 5 principles are about ideas. They're about understanding. The second 5 principles are about application. They're about action. So just to recap, semantic compatibilism is the recognition that different forms of language reveal different kinds of truth. Epistemic humility is recognizing the limits of our map and holding our knowledge responsibly. Discriminating wisdom is the ability to make grounded distinctions about truth and goodness using appropriate methods to determine what's actually true. Emergentism is the understanding that higher order realities emerge from lower level processes, grounded in science and naturalism. And sacred naturalism is the choice to relate to life with reverence, grounded in reality without appealing to anything supernatural. Taken together, these principles enable integration. They allow us to maintain humility and still stand for something. They preserve rationality and truth, as well as poetry and meaning, all online at the same time. The next 5 principles are about what we do with that understanding. Symbolic responsibility is using language and symbols consciously to shape perception and action. Developmental responsibility is meeting people where they are and supporting growth across individuals and cultures. Contextual skillfulness is acting appropriately based on your role and the situation that you're in. Coherence as integrity is aligning with and pursuing clarity as a form of care. And generative responsibility is about building new systems and practices that embody these principles and create real value in the world. These principles guide behavior and shape real-world impact. So taken together, the first 5 are about how we understand reality, and the second 5 are about how we engage with it. So these principles are about integrating truth, meaning, action, and responsibility into a coherent way of living and operating in the world. That's the full set of principles. I hope you can understand why these are all so important. Thank you so much for watching. Big thanks to all the Patreon supporters. If you want to support the development of this work and get involved, join the Patreon. If this was valuable to you, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with people you think would be interested. Check the description for links to the upcoming books. And from here, you can move on to part 2 of the Non-Reductionist Fundamental series. That video is about integration into non-reductionism, the different levels of involvement, leadership, and the structure of the community. I'll see you there. Peace.